doing an analysis and playing around with some data later. There's a document on a step-by-step guide, it's a PDF, to qualitative analysis. What you'll find when you do reading on qualitative analysis is just like quantitative, really. There are different ways to do it. There are different ways to treat words or images or text from newspapers, for example. There's different ways to analyse it. So we're looking at one very simple way of doing it. This will have slightly different methods, but I've selected it again because it's very clear, it's very descriptive, and it's very easy to follow and understand. So that's a useful document to read as well. And then there's an article that I've put on looking at a cohesion intervention, because we're focusing on cohesion. It's specifically with football. So it's an intervention that's intended to enhance task and social cohesion amongst footballers. So again, if you're looking for the theory behind what we're doing and why, that's contained within there. So all those resources are on Wolf. Today I'll email you the qualitative data that you're going to be using for the analysis. I'll email it to you, but I'll also put it on Wolf as well. The email is to make sure that you get it. So make sure that your email details are correct on Wolf, because it'll go to the email that you've put in. And we do have students making mistakes and typos and then don't receive the documents. So qualitative data. How to use qualitative data? I've deliberately put data information, because whenever you say the word data, people switch off. But actually, we all rely on information, which is in effect data, on a daily basis. We'll have a conversation, you'll have a conversation with a colleague. That is information that you analyse to identify the meaning. And we're all natural scientists. We all naturally observe, if I do this, this is what happens. So we all naturally assess data all of the time, but we think of that as information. So it's no different. So what we're going to be looking at today then is how we use qualitative information. And there are different guises in which qualitative information can come, really. So it's looking at how applied psychologists, but applied, you can broaden that to applied practitioners. So as a coach, as a PE teacher, as a strength and conditioning coach, as a lifestyle advisor, whatever it may be, how we can use qualitative information in applied work. We'll look at some of the good practice, if you like, in undertaking. We're focusing on interviews. We'll look at good practice in conducting interviews. We'll then look at some of the issues of validity and reliability, because they're there across data. Again, as Andy said, really, this isn't it's not which is the best quantitative or qualitative, and the old Harry Hill, get them to fight. It's not that. There's not one that's better, they're complementary, and they all have their limitations and they all have their strengths. So it's not saying, well, this is the best. So again, what we'll do is we'll unravel, really, or start to look at some of the issues with the validity and reliability of qualitative data. And then the bit that should be really useful, because it underpins what you're going to do for your assessment, is looking at how to analyse some data. So what we've got is we've got a transcript. The data that you've got to analyse for your assessment is fabricated. Completely false. I made it up. And I made it up so it fits with the quantitative data. So it should be helpful for you to build a story if you choose to look at both the numbers and the words. But the interview that we'll work with later on today is genuine, and it addresses some issues of cohesion, and we'll work through that, and we'll look at how to pull out themes and how to tell the story from the words of others relative to cohesion. So I've put it's only words, but we derive an awful lot of meaning from words, and if you look at this quote, and it would be even better if we had it from the more recent Ryder Cup with the Fasevi. But cohesion is something that's particularly important, and we tend to think of cohesion in team sport context. So the example that you've been provided has been football, but actually teams are formed out of individual athletes as well. And here you've got golf, the Ryder Cup, Europe versus the USA. And you've got the individual here saying, well, we played as a team, we dined as a team, talked as a team, and we won as a team. Team spirit, another term to describe cohesion. So cohesion is not the only term that describes the phenomena. The team spirit this week was the best I've experienced in this, my third Ryder Cup. So there, Darren Clark is basically saying this was pivotal in our success. And what you'll notice, have you been reading the newspapers about the recent Ryder Cup success, is the theme is the same. For Sevi, we pulled together as a team. He may not be with us physically, but he's with us in spirit. And he and his ethos and his approach to golf and the way that he led us brought us together as a team. So you've got the same theme of task and social cohesion underpinning what was perceived, well, was a success. They won again. So qualitative information then, words, giving you an insight into a phenomena, which in this case is cohesion. Other individual sports, swimming for example, we tend to think of as an individual sport, but in relays you get the team element to it. Even outside of the I don't know if you saw Kelly Holmes recently on Piers Morgan's interview, when she was being interviewed, and she was talking about her sporting experience. She didn't talk about it so much in this interview, but when she won her 2 Olympic gold medals, she said, "I'd like to thank." And it's exactly the same. When people win sports personality, they reel off, "I'd like to thank." And what they invariably do is they reel off the people that support them. So even as an individual sport athlete, they have a team of people around them. And I'm using the term team deliberately because there needs to be a cohesion element there as well. You need to get on with the physio. You need to get on with the strength and conditioning coach. You need to get on with the dietitian. You need to get on with the coach. If cracks appear in any of those relationships, then the strength of the team is compromised. And that is both from a task and a social perspective. So the first thing I'm going to do is challenge your perception of what the team cohesion applies to. It's not traditionally just sports like football and rugby and so on and so forth. So what's the value and the danger of information? Now, I'm not going to say anything about this, I'm just going to let you read it. There are many instances of published works, and this is one from obviously a very dated past, but published works that are quite controversial. This is controversial now, but at the time was it controversial? There are other instances where science has published articles claiming to explain a phenomena. Yeah. Now, obviously, some of you may decide you want to agree with that, but on your own head be it. This is a danger of information and how it's presented. This is a danger of data and how it's presented. And this leads me to a point that I'll make about science. And there's a great quote which says, "The currency of science is not truth, but doubt." Because if this was taken to be a truth, then there wouldn't be equal opportunities, if this was taken to be a truth. And this is what I challenge you to do, is not to take anything you ever read in terms of data as read. Don't take it as facts carved in stone and an accurate portrayal of the actual phenomena. The idea of being a scientist, and for you as a practitioner as well, is to question it and go, well, is this true? And to question it for yourself. So the danger of information is people can believe it. And that's the problem with things like Wikipedia. Facts are presented out as just that, facts. Now, they're erroneous at times. They're completely misleading. Or they're ethically wrong. Or morally wrong at times. So that's one of the dangers of information. The value of information is looking to contest and to challenge and provide evidence in support of a counter-argument. So that's the value of information, in challenging. And that's why I've presented that particular study. So what's qualitative data then? Well, traditionally, and the one that we're going to use because it is the most traditional, is interviews. So interviews is the most common form of qualitative information. But qualitative data comes from things like media coverage as well. A lot of people will be working hard, or will have been working hard over the Olympics, and a colleague here at the university is one of them, looking at media coverage of Olympians over the Paralympic and Olympic, the recent Paralympic and Olympics, and looking at the portrayal of males and females and how they're presented, and comparing that to how they've been presented at previous Olympics. That provides qualitative data. Printed media, verbal media, audio media, all provides qualitative data. Observations is qualitative data. Observing someone, making notes on body language, inflection, how people change the tone of voice to emphasize particular things, is qualitative data. So the descriptions, the evaluations, we're looking at thoughts, feelings, behaviours, reports, stories, and another source of qualitative data, which is starting to be used more and more now, are images, pictures. There's a recent book in sociology called Visual Images, and it looks at capturing culture through images. And what happens is the research takes an image of a particular ceremony, perhaps, or an event, and then describes that through the eyes or the experiences of the individuals. And they say a picture can paint 1,000 words, and so it's used as the anchor, really, to describe what's going on. So we can interview, we can observe, we can survey within questionnaires. You may well have filled out questionnaires with open-ended questions, so there's a qualitative element to it, so there's a combination there and then. So you've scored 4 for feeling anxious. What was it about the situation that made you feel anxious? That's the open-ended bit, and you add your data to that. Content analysis of minutes of meetings, policy documents, records, newspapers, biographical accounts, and narratives, people telling their stories or interpreting the things that are going on. When we look at qualitative data, we can look to categorise them in different ways. So that GEQ Andy talked about, within the group environmental questionnaire, what you've got is you had individual scores, you had average scores for defence, midfield and attack, and then you had a total score for the whole team. Now, qualitative is no different, because what you get is, if you took the quantitative, you had an average score for the team, and it tells you one thing, and you make an assumption about the level of cohesion within that football team based on that average score. And that typically is how the GEQ has been used. So they've said this team is cohesive or this isn't. Well, the error with that is obviously you have particular players within that football team that are coming out with far lower than the average GEQ scores. So some of the individuals in that team are less happy than the average. So to say that the team is happy in terms of task and social cohesion would be erroneous, because that isn't the experience of all individuals. It's the same with qualitative, really. You can tailor your analysis to different levels. So at an organisational level, you could lose the flavour of individual experiences by summarising the experiences of the collective. Same thing. So you could choose to focus down on individuals and accumulate individual experiences from different perspectives. So if you're looking at a sport organisation, for example, England Rugby, the RFU, you could look at the organisation, in which case you'd include the experiences of the managers, the coaches, the support staff, the players, the reserves. You'd capture them all. But you could choose to present that as a collective, or you could choose to look at specific individuals within that organisation and look at and focus on them. So interviewing is what we're going to focus on. And there are different ways of organising and undertaking an interview. There's structured, semi-structured, unstructured. We're going to explain each of these. We can look at dual interviews, so you interview people together. Group interviews, so it's more than 2 people. Focus groups, where you add almost talking points, so you might show an image or a photo and ask them to discuss that. Hence focus groups. Focus groups are used quite heavily in marketing. And in the field interviews. So you capture them in their context, and that has some benefits, capturing people in the environment in which you're really interested in. You might get a different account. So the first type of interview is an unstructured interview. So this is where you go in and you don't have any predetermined questions. There's nothing really, that you don't have anything written down. And what that means is it can vary really quite considerably across individuals. The questions that you're going to be asking across individuals is going to vary quite dramatically. But it will have some structure, even though the questions aren't determined, even though the questions aren't written down. If you're asking about cohesion, you know the theory and you know the literature. So your questions are bound to tap into task and social cohesion at some point. Even though the questions aren't written down, they will be addressed within the interview at some stage, because we're guided by what we know. So we're guided by the last paper that we read or the theory that we've heard about when we ask questions. So they're in-depth, they're exploratory, they're inductive. And what we mean by inductive is we're really trying to get the person that we're interviewing to come up with and lead the interview and navigate the interview to a large extent. And they're looking at people's lived experiences. They all are, to be honest. With a structured interview, on the other side of the coin, you've got fixed questions. So you may have 10 questions on team cohesion. So question 1 may be, in overall, taken collectively, how would you describe the team spirit? Because you could use a term that they may more commonly use rather than team cohesion. How would you describe the team spirit within the football team you play for? Could be the first question. And then you move on to the next question. There's no deviation, there's no prompts, there's no probes, there's no follow-up. They answer the question, you move on to question 2. So that has some strengths, but it also has some limitations. And then you've got semi-structured interview, which is in the middle. It's a bit of both. You have some fixed questions, but you use prompts and probes to follow up from that. So you've got maybe 5 or 6 fixed questions, but whatever they answer in response to that, you explore and you elaborate with prompts and probes, and you saturate your questioning on that particular question, and then you move on to the next. So it's interactive. When we interview, and if you read somebody who's good at interviewing, you'll see them do a lot of this. When you interview somebody, you may not know them. It may be the first time they've met you. They may make particular assumptions about you based on your status and why you're asking them. They may be sceptical. If you're working with a team as a sports psychologist, they may be thinking, what are you going to do with this information? How honest am I going to be with you? Because you may be passing this on to the coach, or you may pass it on to the physio. Will it influence selection in any way? So the warmth and the openness that you're able to generate between you and the person that you're interviewing is really quite important to really get a true reflective account of their experiences. So body language is quite influential. Having the open posture, smiling, nodding, showing that you're listening. A commonly used technique in interviewing is different ways of reflecting. Counselling psychology spends a lot of time working on the reflective skills of individuals when they're interviewing. And there are different ways of reflecting. Firstly, you can pick up on a last comment with a question mark. And when you're doing that, you're largely trying to elaborate. We can't make assumptions with data or information. If somebody makes a comment that's quite ambiguous, you need to pick up on that and clarify it. So if they use a term that's sports specific, you need to get them to explain what that term is. And that's picking up on the last comment and asking them to elaborate is one example, which is here. Pick up on a previous remark they've made. It's not always, in fact, it's quite frustrating. If you're being interviewed and then the interviewee stops you to ask a question about something you've said there and then, it's quite frustrating if it happens regularly because it interrupts your train of thought and it stops you telling the story that you want to tell. So quite often the best thing to do is to let the person you're interviewing carry on, but make a mental note of it, or if your memory's not great, scribble a note down, and pick up on it later. Let them tell that story, let them finish what they're saying, and then go back to it. This is another one. Pick a topic that hasn't been referred to before. So there may be something that you know based on theory, or it may be other people you've interviewed about the team cohesion within that team have identified a particular concern or strength, and they haven't mentioned it. So you introduce that because you're wanting to... What you're doing there is if you're interviewing more than one person within a team and you're exploring a particular phenomena, you're triangulating the data between the 5, 6, 7, 8 individuals to corroborate, to add strength to the weight of an opinion. So if all of the team members have been saying, actually, you know, the centre midfield player is a bit of an arse, they could be saying, and that's the theme that's coming across them all, you as a consultant know that you have some social dynamic issues to address there, or perhaps some interpersonal communication skills with the centre midfield player, if that's undermining the cohesion of the whole group. So what you're doing is you're triangulating the data between the different interviews and adding strength to the weight of an opinion or a view. Different ways of questioning, open versus closed questions, and they both have their use, they both have their strength. So an open question is something like, tell me about your training schedule in a typical week. You've asked them to describe. What do you enjoy about it? You've asked them to specifically identify. How does that fit in within your daily schedule? You've asked them to conceptualise. In all instances, they can't say yes or no. They can't say, that's right, really. They've got to provide a descriptive response. So what you're doing with open questionings is you're encouraging a wealth of descriptive information coming back at you. And typically in a good interview, you know an interview's going well if you ask a question and then you can just sit back and listen. You've set them off. Typically. It depends on the person that you're interviewing and how confident they are. But if you transcribe an interview and you're doing most of the talking and they're saying very little, and you're transcribing, you're typing out your own comments mainly, then that's an interview where they haven't really opened up for whatever reason. And it's worth looking at how you've been asking questions in that instance. Here's a closed questions, examples of closed questions. They do have a use, they're not to be demonised. You train hard in a week, don't you? There is a problem with that, and it seems to be putting a value judgment on training hard. But it's a closed question. Do you enjoy exercise? Leads to a yes-no response. If you wanted to know why they enjoy exercise, you then have to follow up with another question. Training doesn't seem to fit in with your daily schedule, does it? Again, yes-no response. And they may be useful if you want to categorise people. So if you wanted to categorise people according to those that enjoy and those that don't, that's a very simple way, using the qualitative data, of putting them into different categories of individuals who have different experiences of the same thing. Effective listening is essential. And you are displaying that to various extents now, and you will throughout the lecture. You know, we all switch off. We all wander off to thinking what we're going to have for tea. We all lose our concentration. And when you lose your concentration, and I do it, we're not immune. You lose your concentration, you then have to pick up the thread again of what's been said, and you might have missed some vital information. So everything that's been said after that may make absolutely no sense to you at all. So when you're interviewing someone, listening and being able to maintain your attention is absolutely crucial. And it's crucial because it leads to your next question. Your next question is going to indicate whether or not you've really heard what they've been saying, whether or not you've really understood what they've been telling you. You won't be able to explore their experiences as effectively if you're not listening to what they're actually saying. And it could lead you to filling gaps. There's a phenomenon in psychology where if you're listening to a story and information isn't provided or you missed it for some reason, you'll fill it in with what you expected to hear, what we think to be most probable. And I'll give you an example of that, because this is information that wasn't provided. When you looked at the quantitative data, when you looked at the GEQ data about the football team, was it a male or was it a female football team? Okay, so in the blog, in the cafe blog that Andy set up, what gender was ascribed to that football team? In the comments that you guys were making in talking about the GEQ, did anybody suggest what the gender of the team might be? Yes, they did. People are saying no. Individual people might not have. But looking across it, the only time reference was made to gender, it was made to one gender only. What was that? Yeah, male. We assume it was a male football team. And that's exemplifying exactly the point I'm trying to make. It's a dangerous thing to do that. And so I've deliberately, in the qualitative data, made it a female football team. Because we can't assume. You shouldn't assume. And that's why effective listening is very important. Because what happens is, when we miss the information, we fill the gaps in with assumptions, with probabilities. Now, it is probable that it would be a male football team, but it's not guaranteed. So that's why I played the devil's advocate and made it female. Because we don't want to assume. We'll make mistakes. And we'll go completely down the wrong path. So here's an example of qualitative information. And this is Kath Granger, having won the gold medal at the recent Olympics. And what I want you to do is just listen to her interview. It's just an interview, but we take from that. What do you take from her interview? What themes, what information do you take from the interview about her state of mind, the experiences that she'd had leading up to it? Anything. Just listen to it, and then I want you to relay back to me what you take from that.
Carrying a nation's hopes on her shoulders, Kath Granger was so long the nearly woman of Olympic rowing. But after 3 silvers, the fans sensed this was her golden moment. Granger and her partner Anna Watkins began as the hottest of favourites. In their 2 years together, they'd never been beaten, and it wasn't hard to see why. Instantly, they powered into the lead.
Great Britain on a mission.
The Australians tried to cling on, but swept along on a tide of emotion. This time, silver simply wasn't an option.
Well, the nation expected Great Britain deliver Olympic champion.
So at last,
course, she's got it. Kath Granger, Olympic champion. And just listen to these fans. They know they've seen something very special. A dream finally fulfilled.
In just 7 minutes, years of frustration had been wiped away. For Granger, it was the moment of a lifetime.
I feel this medal of all of them is sort of the people's medal, because I feel so many people have been behind me and supported me and wanted this for me as much as I have most of the way, and I kind of feel, you know, it's off the back of everyone who I've ever worked with, everyone I've ever rode with, everyone who's helped me, everyone going back to, you know, my family who were there from the beginning, to my friends at school, to university, to every single person's been a part of this, and it makes the medal feel so much more special.
And her perseverance had won the ultimate reward. Granger and Watkins, an incredible moment for an incredible partnership.
The moment that we got into the boat together, which was nearly 3 years ago, we knew it was special. I believed it from that moment, and today we've had to put all that belief on the line. And I don't really have words. It's absolutely wonderful. I knew we could do it.
And then the sweetest of family reunions. 3 times Liz Granger had watched her daughter come so close, but her belief never wavered.
I was just so sure this was her moment, she was going to do it, and she did. So, but the tears did come, and during the national anthem as well.
It was relief more than anything else.
Relief, pride, everything.
And so for fans, family, but above all 2 remarkable rowers, a quite unforgettable day. One of sport's longest hard luck stories finally has a happy ending. Andy Smith, BBC News, Eton Dorney.
You can applaud. What do you take from that? That's data. That's qualitative data that could be used in research, including the narratives from the BBC reporters in describing the build-up. So if you were to pull out information and summarise that information, which is what you're doing with qualitative data, just the same way you do with quantitative, what's the story? What do you pull out? Because this was one of the stories of the games, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and in terms of, there's a cohesion story there, because she's talking about the continuity of support, people that stuck with her and stayed with her, and all the people there from when she first started, like you say, from school all the way through. So there's a cohesion element of a support network that she has around her that she felt was, again, really influential in her success. And I defy you to listen to any sports personality speech without them talking about that. No man is an island. So that's one of the things. What else? What else do you pick up from this particular story?
The area of self-belief. So obviously when her and partner are talking, it comes through quite strongly that they believe that they're going to do it.
Yeah.
From the initial phase, so that's quite strong.
Yeah. I mean, she said, Helen Watkins said, I can't put it in words, there's no words to describe it. If you were interviewing her, you'd try and encourage her to think of those words to describe it, because you'd want to be able to describe it as well. But she said it was just like a chemistry. The minute we got in the boat together, there was something there, and we just clicked, and we knew it was there. Now, again, there's a cohesion element there. Is that task? Is that social? You can't assume. You'd have to make further inquiry, but there's certainly an element of cohesion within the boat that they knew was there from the very beginning. What else? The belief, who else showed belief in them that was interviewed? Yeah, Mum. Said we knew this was her time. Previous information, it isn't in this, but how did Kath Granger, when she came out of the boat in Beijing, having won a silver medal for the 3rd time, what did she say? How did she describe herself? And it was kind of the hook line for the story, for this particular story. What did she say when she came out of the boat? Silver medalist for the 3rd time. 12 years of training to not win and come close.
Did she say it's felt like failure or something?
Not a failure. She said, always the bridesmaid, never the bride.
Yeah.
And she was quite emotional when she said it as well. So there's a lot of emotions leading into this, because you can imagine on 4-year cycles how much time you invest in the water and so on and so forth. So that's why this was a particularly big story, and it's been used to exemplify. She has now been marketing university courses because she's talked about perseverance and the wanting to better yourself and never giving up. And they've used her in university marketing at some of the universities in this area, I might add, to try and recruit. And her story of always the bridesmaid, never the bride, don't give up because you will get there. Anything else from that particular interview? Yeah.
I think that her partner has got to be, they've got to be like incredibly close together, like the cohesion thing, because there's so much pressure on her being her partner that she's come second, that her partner's come second in 3 previous Olympics. So there's almost added pressure on her partner to like, put her through.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's a lot of, we need to get this person a gold. Steve Redgrave talked about it. Do you know how she was recruited into Rome? Anybody know? In Beijing, she'd never sat in a boat. Never done it. Never been in a boat. She was recruited through the Sporting Giants programme that was spearheaded by Steve Redgrave, which basically the criteria were tall, and she was slightly below. She talked about how she was slightly below the height requirements, so when they went around they were measuring them, she stood up on her toes to get in, to meet the requirement, because she was slightly short. And sporting background. And they were screened at talent camps, and she was picked on the basis of that. So in Beijing she hadn't pulled an oar, she hadn't been in a boat. So even more pressure, going back to that point, because she didn't have, possibly, the rowing experience. But they went into it unbeaten. So the point I'm making with this little excerpt is from that qualitative information, you can really weave the story behind their success and the expectations that were placed on them and how they went about achieving success. That's the value of, it's called data, but it's information. And that's how we need to attend to and listen to what's been said in order to direct the questions and ascertain the facts and the information. We try and ascertain the facts as much as we can. But with self-report, as Andy said, it is self-report, so it's always constrained by various things, which is one of the limitations and one of the things that we'll look at. So, roadblocks to listening then. Tendency to judge and evaluate a participant's message. If, for example, you find women's boxing morally objectionable, you don't agree with it, then you may well not have shared in the enthusiasm for the gold medal successes at the Olympics. And when they start to tell their stories and their narratives, you may interpret that in a very different way, because we bring our values, our prejudice, our expectations into a conversation. When we're listening to someone or we're talking to them, we bring that bias in. And that can prevent us from listening effectively. It can stop us from picking up the message of what's actually being said. A tendency to stop attending due to distractions, noise, time of day, topic. I did some research with I do work with umpire officials in netball and other sports as well, and they talk about actually distractions are a problem in officiating effectively, and distractions, they say, can include things like feeling cold or hungry, affect our ability to listen effectively. You know, the worst slot to present to you guys or at a conference is just before lunch because people just want to go and get something to eat, so they don't listen. Nightmare. That, and after there's always a conference dinner thing with drinks. The morning after that is even worse. Alcohol is also a roadblock. Temptation to respond to missing pieces of information by asking questions. That's the point I made earlier about interrupting. People can get upset and offended by that, and you can stop them from saying something that was going to be very important. The temptation to solve problems, to start throwing in, and we do that because we want to help. And this is more in everyday conversations. When someone's describing something that's happened to them, we might butt in with a, well, did you think about doing that? And so that affects our ability to listen to them. Preoccupation with yourself. There's lots of research. How many of you want to go on to become teachers or coaches following on from this? So you want to go into education in any way? There's a lot of research. The first time you stand in front of a class, or as a student, the first time you stand and present. And I've done this myself. When I did my Masters at Leeds, I was doing a presentation on something to do with physiology, and I planted a question. One of my friends had said, right, you can ask this. And I prepared my answer. And I was stood at the front, and I was nervous. And nerves create a preoccupation with yourself. You start to think about how you're presenting yourself, what you're doing in terms of body language, how you sound. Do I sound confident? I need to sound confident. I want to sound confident. And you get preoccupied with sounding confident, and then you stutter, and then you become, it's like a bubble. And you probably all have experienced this bubble. So when she put her hand up and to ask the question, I didn't listen because I thought I knew what she was going to say. And because I was nervous. And partway through, I realised she was asking something completely different. And I was stuck then. And I remember saying to her at the end, what did you do that for? And she said, well, actually, I was genuinely interested. But my point to that is, you've got to be really wary about this, preoccupation with yourself, when you're trying to gather information from people. And emotions play a large part in that, feeling anxious. So to try and resolve that anxiety and to try and make sure that you reduce the preoccupation with yourself, there are some tips here, and that's preparing. There's the old saying, isn't there? Fail to prepare, prepare to fail. You've got to know what you're going to say. You've got to do your research. If you want to know about cohesion, read the theory, know the theory, read the articles, know what's already known and build from that. You're going confident then. So prepare. Find an appropriate time, place, so you're more likely to don't get them when it's late at night, for example, but you may be forced to do that because they may be tired. Record the interview because you won't remember everything that's been said, so get consent for that and record it so you can listen back and you can follow up if you need to. Do it early. You know, if you're going to use qualitative methods in any of the work that you're doing from here in, run a pilot. Pilot it first. You want to know that your questions work. You want to know that you're confident. You want to know that they're not coming up with anything that's completely unexpected that you might not have considered. So do it early to get the practice in and make sure that it works properly. Use the prompts and the probes. Summarise. So what you seem to be saying is. So I take from that these are the issues. Summarising. Clarification. So can I just check, when you use that term, do you mean? You need to be absolutely clear on what they're saying. Engage them in the interview, and that's with the body language and the nodding, and just be humorous. You know, if you are pan-faced and it appears to be robotic, you won't draw them into the discussion. You want it to feel like a conversation, not an interview. The more it feels like a conversation sat with a coffee, the more they're likely to give you the information in a very honest way, or as honest as possible. So interview someone you know for the first time, be creative and enjoy it, really, are tips for interviewing. So we get on to some of the problems. Validity and reliability. Now, some qualitative researchers say you can't apply those terms to qualitative data in the same way as you would with quantitative. Clarity of meaning, interviewer bias, which I've sort of talked about, but we will pick up on it again. Conversational control, how you direct the interview and the information that's coming out. Time and expense. A lot of people may opt for qualitative data analysis because they see it as easy, but actually it takes an awful lot of time to conduct the interview, to organise them, conduct them, transcribe them and analyse them is a really time-intensive process. That's one of the big drawbacks with interviews, which is why when you look at studies, if you pick a journal article off the shelf and you looked at it by quantitative, qualitative, there's a guarantee, pretty much. And the guarantee is that the sample size in an interview, qualitative-based study, is going to be lower. And that's because of the time taken to go through the process. It takes quite a long time. So validity and reliability, in essence, how truthful, how honest an account a piece of research actually is. And this is across all research, irrespective of the method you use. And it's something that you need to consider when you're working with data. So, factors that can lower validity then. Ambiguity. If the person interviewed or the data that you've got or you're given, so the qualitative data that you get, some of it may be more ambiguous than other sections within the interview. The more ambiguous it is, the more open it is to interpretation, and you will all, guaranteed, interpret it in a slightly different way, based on your experiences and your expectations. Having inadequate time to undertake an interview, and I've had this, because I've done interviews at national squad weekends, and the coach comes in and says, right, I need to take them now, because they've got a session. You haven't finished interviewing them. You haven't fully explored everything that they wanted to talk about. So it lowers validity, because you haven't fully captured their experiences. So it's a problem. Questions inappropriate for the concepts being measured. Now, I noticed on the GEQ, there's a question about we party together. Did you see that on the GEQ? Which aspect of cohesion is that tapping into? But if you don't, you might not necessarily party with your teammates, but does that make you any more or any less socially cohesive, do you think? Take, for example, one question. Take, for example, the age of the individual. So you're working with a junior national team. Would you expect them to be out partying with their peers, with their teammates, necessarily? No. There might be a good reason why they don't. It can't be a given that because they don't party with them, that they're less socially cohesive. They just may be socially cohesive in different ways. So, if you ask someone, well, do you party with them? Do you go out and party? And they say no, you can't assume from that they don't have social cohesion. So it's not, the question isn't necessarily appropriate, it doesn't fit perfectly as a measure of social cohesion. Inexperience of the researchers. So by that it's that you don't necessarily listen effectively, you don't guide the interview, you don't know the literature as well as you might, so therefore you don't navigate the concept effectively. Reliability. Consistent and repetitive. If you asked them today about, do you like the team that you compete with? And they say yes, generally, and this is why I like them. And then if you ask them in 2 weeks' time and you say, do you like the team you compete with? And they say yes, and these are the reasons. If that's the same, then the idea is that has reliability. But let's look at real world here. Within a team, have you ever been part of a team and the team is this? At the beginning of the season, this is the membership, and it's this at the end of the season, exactly the same membership. It does happen, but it's not uncommon. In fact, it's very common that this is the team at the beginning and this is the team at the end for various reasons. Injury, moving, relocating, dropping out of sport. So it means that it would underpin the reliability because the membership of the group changes. The membership of the team will change. So because the membership changes, then the scores are going to change. So there are reasons why you could expect changes if you assess at one time and then at a different time. So you've got to be a bit careful with reliability. To what extent would a researcher and another researcher obtain the same or very similar results? So if I was to interview somebody about cohesion and someone else was to interview the same person about cohesion, chances are we wouldn't get exactly the same responses. The themes may be similar. The way in which they were addressed would vary a little bit. There's a questionnaire called the Task and Ego Orientation Scale, the TOSC. And there's a guy called Chris Harwood, who's at Loughborough, who's tested this TOSC. It looks at what motivates us. In terms of setting goals, are we task-orientated as in, I want to be better at this? Or are we ego-orientated as in, I just want to be that person, essentially? And he got people to fill out the TOSC in two different contexts. One was within a sporting environment, and the second, just change the context, was in a non-sporting environment. And he found something really quite interesting. To me, you might think that's really, you need to get out more, but he found that ego orientation, same people, but when they filled it out in a competitive environment, their ego orientation scores were higher than they were when they competed the very same questionnaire in a non-competitive sports environment. In other words, what that seems to suggest is their state of mind and their reference differed. So the responses that they gave were influenced by the environment that they were in, same measure. It kind of looks at this reliability issue then. It throws a little bit of an issue to consider when you're looking at reliability. Andy said last week about self-efficacy scores. Females typically score lower. So a 50% confident for a male and a female is very different. So you just need to almost know the rules for interpreting it, is the take-home message from that. So, 3 types of reliability in qualitative. Inter-observer agreement. So if you have 2 people, and you do this a lot with qualitative data, so you've got one interview and you code it separately. So you code the same interview independently, and we're doing coding later, so you'll know what I'm talking about then. And then you get together and go, okay, these are the themes I found in the data. And you sit and you discuss it. To what extent were the results the same? That's inter-observer agreement. Test, retest. Same measure, same respondents, different points in time. We've already talked about that. Internal consistency. different questions, do they really measure the same thing? You get them more in questionnaires, but you also get it in qualitative data as well. So, with interviews, there are a few things that can influence validity and reliability. First thing is the respondent. To what extent are they going to give you an accurate, an honest, and a complete answer? Well, they may distort the facts. I had a student do a project years ago who was looking at emotional responses to sports injury, and she was looking to be a physio, ultimately. So she was doing some work with them in a physio capacity as participants, and she got a questionnaire data back. And these participants were saying that they weren't emotionally affected by the injury, and she was saying, well, I know that's not true, because I treat them, and I listen to what they're saying. So the quantitative data was saying one thing, and their experiences and her observations and what they were saying was saying a completely different thing. So the willingness of somebody to be honest is influenced by various things. Impression management. We seek to manage people's impressions of ourselves, and we also try and convince ourselves as well. We may not want to accept that we're feeling upset or anxious about something, so we tell ourselves we're not. And in order to tell ourselves we're not, we write down that we're not. So we distort the facts, in other words, or we don't choose to accept the facts. Respondent avoidance. I don't want to go there. I'll steer the conversation away, and you try and bring them back, and they steer it away again, in which case you're not really getting to the issues that they talk about, or you want to talk about, and holding back information. Because we don't know. If they withhold information, we don't necessarily know that. So it's deliberate and it's non-deliberate. We could do it deliberately because we're embarrassed, we feel inadequate. We're offering the socially desirable response. There was something called Morgan and the performance, the profile of mood states. He developed something called the iceberg profile. What Morgan said was, when athletes perform well, they are high in vigour. So this is the iceberg, high in vigour, up here on the score. Everything else is low. Tension, anger, depression, low. So in an athlete, if they're going to perform well, you should see an iceberg profile. And at the time, players were selected for team inclusion on the basis of their mood profile. So what are you going to do? Irrespective of how you feel, you're going to say, well, I'm high in vigour, and I'm down here on this, because you want to get selected. So you'll distort the facts. Socially desirable responses. I did this with England Netball. I worked with the under-17s and the under-19s and did a research project with them. Quantitative, qualitative, it was mixed methods. Used something called the brief cope. It's got a measure on it in terms of how you cope, and one of them is substance use, and it asks them if they drink to cope with stress. All of the responses came back as 2. There's 2 items per score. 2 means not at all, because a score of 1 means not at all, so you add them together, 2, not at all. They were all saying, I don't drink at all. When I interviewed them, they were talking about going out on the lash, they were talking about getting bladdered, having a good vent as part of that when they were really stressed. Some of these were underage. The point of that is, I'm putting it down in writing, and I'm not giving it, because the coaches might see this, I don't drink, I don't touch this stuff. But when you speak to them, and once they got, because it was a focus group interview, so once they got talking, it came out, it tripped out, and then they started talking about going to the pub with their mates, and so on and so forth. So there's definitely this, because they talked about the pressures of being a model athlete, in terms of dietary control and lifestyle, and going to bed early, and so on and so forth. Memory loss and confusion. It may be this, we're just not self-aware. You know, we do a lot of things and we don't stop to reflect on or consider why. So when it comes to something like coping, for example, we automatically kick in strategies to cope with something that's stressful, often without thinking about it. So when you're asked to reflect on it, you know, if I ask someone how they coped with an exam coming up, or how they coped with the pressure of competing for their country, quite often you get a shrug. Just do, is what they'll say. And it's not that they don't use coping strategies, it's just they're not fully aware of what it is they're doing, because it's habitual. So we don't think about it. So that's one of the other limitations. Well, not a limitation, it's something you need to be aware of when you're interviewing people. And I like interviews where I ask questions, and you have the light bulb moment when people go, yeah, now I think about it, I do this. And that's great for me, because what you're doing is you're tapping into this. You're increasing. It's not always a good thing, by the way. If they're going to go out and compete and they go, now I think about it, I do feel pretty crappy. That wouldn't be the ideal time for them to become more aware about something that might undermine their performance. So there is a timing issue. this as well. A friend of mine called it the white coat syndrome, and we were co-consulting with England volleyball at the time, and there was a player at the time who my colleague said that person seems to have white coat syndrome, as in she was suggesting that they would almost fabricate or make up stories as an attention-seeking strategy to try and get some attention, really. So you'll get this in research. People will think, right, what do you need to find? And especially when they're trying to help you for a dissertation. What do you need to find? What results do you need? What do you need me to say? I've had people say that. What do you want me to say? You don't want them to say anything. You want an honest account. But if they try and second guess what you're looking for and what the answer is that you're wanting, and again, that undermines the validity and reliability. So, clarity of meaning. Two things. There's like a communication process. They may fail to understand what you're asking and how you're asking it, is the first part. And then you may misunderstand the information that they're presenting back. So we can have misinterpretation and misunderstandings from both parties when you're undertaking an interview. Interviewer bias. There's lots of research in psychology to say that we can change the meaning of a sentence or a question by how we front load it, by where we place the words, or how we use inflection. So, for example, the term, "it was something I said," can be interpreted very differently. So if we change the inflection, so if we go down, so "it was something I said," is inflection down, as opposed to inflection up. "It was something I said," up. What's the difference in how you interpret that?
Defensive, and it's really defensive, and the other one's really offensive, attacking, is that right?
It was almost, the first one, down, said, is almost apologetic. I'm really sorry. The other one is aggressive. What do you mean? Tell me why it was something I said. And it's exactly the same thing. So as an interviewer, you've got to be careful not only what you say, but how you say it, because you will evoke, potentially, a very different response. And your body language as well. They might start telling a story, and you might look visibly a bit, that's a bit ethical. And they'll start to then twist their story, because they're gauging you all the time for information back, in terms of how you're receiving the information. Interviews are co-constructions, and what that means is that a perception of an experience, first construction comes from them. So they give you their perception of an experience. So they give you their perception of the cohesion within a team. So I perceive it to be this. When you write it up and you represent that, so when you code it, the second layer of construction comes on because you interpret their interpretations. So it becomes a co-construction. And that can create some problems as well, because you may not interpret it as they intended. You may misunderstand. So there are potential problems that arise there. Conversational control. The rapport building skill that I talked about. Focus groups are a real issue here. When you do group or focus group interviews, you get 7, well, ideally 5, 6 is a nice number for a group interview. And you start the interview and you sit around in your semicircle and you get the ball rolling and you get them all to speak. What do you think happens when you do a focus group or a group interview? They talk over each other, yeah. Yeah, and that's what happens a lot. You'll always have 2 or 3 that dominate and really want to get their opinion across, and you always get those that sit back and just let, like you say, let everybody else talk for them. And the problem with that is you can't assume that the information and the experiences that you're being given are reflective of those people that are sitting back. And I've had this a lot, because you get dominant members of a team environment doing all the speaking. Quite often it's a captain, because they're certain that they're given that role, so they take it on in the focus groups as well. So they do all the talking, and you get those sitting back. Now, quite often those sitting back might be the ones that really aren't happy with the cohesion of the team. They don't like what the team ethos is about. They don't like other members of the team. So if you're looking at cohesion, you're not capturing, in your data set, you're not capturing the goalkeeper, who wouldn't be happy, for example. So there's a real skill to navigating a focus group to try and make sure that you get all of the comments. And it's about respect, because you're going to have different opinions, and what you don't want within a focus group is someone judging somebody else and beating them down and stopping them from talking. You want to hear every perspective. I've mentioned the time and expense. so we don't need to go through that. Perceived anonymity. When you do a questionnaire, you don't have to write your name on it. When you're talking, you give away facts and information about yourself. So you might talk about your playing position, you might talk about the team that you play for, you might talk about the league that you play in. The more information that's reported, the easier it is to identify that person and the less anonymous they become. So when you present qualitative information, you take out identifying features. And you tell them you do that because you want them to speak freely and openly and honestly. So you need to, that's one of the considerations. It doesn't have to be a limitation, but it should be a consideration. The non-standardised questions, what that's basically saying is when you have the unstructured interview, the more unstructured the interview is, the more challenging it is to draw generalisations from the data, because you get different responses, a whole range of different responses. Strengths. Well, it allows depth. It allows you to really get into the whats and the whys and the wheres and the whens and address all of those questions that can be more challenging with quantitative data. You can get highly personalised data, so you can tap into people's perceptions. William James, a great psychologist, said perception is of probable things. And what he meant by that is perception doesn't necessarily give you an accurate account of what happened. It gives you someone's interpretation of what happened based on their previous experiences and what their expectations were and all of these things. And qualitative data will give you, it gives you their perceptions. So it helps you to understand where they're coming from and why and what's formed those experiences. It gives an opportunity for probing, and that isn't anything indecent. That is where you're following up with the, you're looking to clarify, you're looking to get the elaboration. And you can't necessarily do that with the quantitative. You're giving them more responsibility and freedom to say what they want. Some of you said with the GEQ that you didn't find it a particularly enjoyable questionnaire to fill out. They were some of the comments. Didn't really enjoy doing it. I found the reverse score items quite difficult. Have you ever filled out a questionnaire where it said something like, circle the emotions you experienced at this time, or it asks you to do something, and what you felt or your experience isn't on the list? It's just not there, it's not represented. Have you had that? Well, you probably will in your third year, because you'll be inundated to take part in projects, believe me. It's frustrating, because you look at it and you go, well, actually, I'm none of those, but I don't have a choice but to tick one, so you almost get a false representation. With qualitative, you say it as you feel it. It allows, qualitative is quite often used if it's a new phenomena of investigation, it's something unique, because we don't know anything about it. So it's called inductive, it's a start point, it sets a basis of expectations. But it can allow us to test existing or existing knowledge or existing understanding. It can allow us to explore that and try and look at it from different perspectives and shed a new light on things. Give us a new interpretation to try and move our ideas and our thinkings forwards. I've already talked about the meanings and the thinking, the perceptions. It can be used to explore as well as confirm. Good return rate. When you give questionnaires out, you quite often get a return rate of 20, maybe 40%. So you send them out, you can expect most of them aren't going to come back in. With an interview, the good return rate is because once they say they're going to do an interview, they've gone through the thinking process and they've already committed to doing it. So once you get someone to agree, more than likely they will do the interview. That's a good return rate, really. Interviews can be useful for people who maybe have learning difficulties, speak English as a second or third language, because you can then help explain. You can explain and you can explore their experiences, and you've got the time to follow up and prompt and probe and get the information that you need. So, Ali's coming in 5 minutes. To recap then, structured interviews. You've got control. You've set the questions. It makes it easier to compare the responses because they're under the headings, so you can compare across the groups. So the analysis is a little bit easier. For those that are inexperienced, you don't have the anxieties and the concerns. You know what you're going to ask. You've got no prompts or probes to think about. So you go in, you ask the question, you move on to the next one. So there's a certain amount of confidence raising there. Semi-structured, building a conversation. So you've got your questions that you've got set, but you then explore around that. You don't have to adhere to it. Your questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you don't necessarily have to follow in that order. You can move from question 1 to question 4, depending on what they're saying, the semi-structured. You don't have to be rigid in adhering to it. The unstructured, every interview is different. They set the agenda. You follow them and what they want to say. Again, it's not as structured, unstructured as you might think, because you have your themes that you want to explore, but you allow them really to navigate, and you prompt and probe and follow up on what they're saying. I won't go through all of these, but there are different strategies, and I've talked about some of them, that you can use to try and enhance qualitative validity, so the trustworthiness of the data. An example, data triangulation, data sources. So the cohesion, interview more than one participant from the team. And as you triangulate the data, you get more truth, if you like, in terms of insight into the cohesiveness of that team. Methods triangulation, mixed methods, becoming more and more common. So you've got your GEQ and you've got your qualitative, and that's exactly what we've given to you. And I've deliberately tailored the interview so it does triangulate with the questionnaire. Your task is to see how it triangulates. Does it support or does it challenge the data from the GEQ? Investigator triangulation, different investigators coding the data. So you get increased objectivity, if you like, because you've got different perspectives and then you agree on the themes. Participant feedback. Here's your interview I've transcribed. Can you check it's accurate? Take out anything that you don't want to be put forward. Change anything, make any amendments you want. Okay, you're happy with that? I've got the interview back. Now I'm going to code it. Now I present the codes back to you. Do you agree with the way I've coded it as a reflection of your experiences? That's participant feedback. It's another method. There are more, but there are different ways that you can increase the trustworthiness of your data. And the more of those, for your dissertation worth remembering, the more of these you put in place, the more reliable your data, the more confident you are with the discussion, the more robust the methods, the higher the grade goes, essentially, which is the important point, probably, or one of the important points from your perspective. So worth bearing that slide in mind. Let's go through that one. So Ali is going to be here any second. The key thought for the day, really, leading into the next session, Ali's going to see you for half an hour for any questions that you might have, and if you don't, you can grab a coffee. We're back over in WN004 to play with some data, is the next session, to actually sit and play with that. That's important to come back to, because obviously that's your first assessment, is the live data analysis, where you navigate us through the data analysis that you've undertaken. So I'm going to give you a dry run, essentially, of that next door. But the key thought, I quite like this quote. Scanlon did quite a lot of qualitative research. We felt it was time to walk a mile in the heads of those whose experiences we were studying, rather than limiting our experiences to relationships and questionnaire items generated from our less than expert heads. That relates to a point I made, whereby if you fill out a questionnaire, you've got responses that are offered based on someone else's expectations. They don't necessarily meet your experiences. So the thought of the day for the qualitative is, it puts the respondent in control in terms of saying, well, this is what was important to me. This was my experience. With a quantitative, it tends to be, this is my expectation of what your experience might be. One is not better than the other. We're keen to emphasise that. They both have their strengths. They both have their limitations. They're complementary in many respects. Some reading. There are a few key texts that we do have in the library that if you think that you're going to use qualitative methods for your dissertation or any of your projects or any of the work, or indeed as part of this module, they're the recommended texts to read. There's also the PDF that I've put on Wolf, the step-by-step guide to qualitative analysis. It's worth looking at that. Okay, so we're going to finish there for half an hour. If you have any questions regarding the module, Ali is going to be here any second. But if not, I'll see you in WN004 at 11 o'clock.